In the dim, crumbling ruins of Eldoria, where the sun never rises and the air hums with a quiet dread, a young thief named Kael crouches in the shadows of a forgotten king's tomb. His fingers close around a jagged shard of obsidian, its surface cold and alive, pulsing faintly with a dark, unearthly rhythm. The moment it touches his skin, a low whisper fills his mind, not words, but a presence, ancient and hungry. Kael knows he shouldn't have taken it. He knows it's dangerous, but desperate times call for desperate choices. His sister lies dying, her breath shallow and her skin pale, and this relic, this cursed, whispering thing, might be the only way to save her. As he slips out of the tomb, the ground beneath him shudders, and the air grows icy, as if the kingdom itself is recoiling from what he's done. Something has stirred. Something that should have stayed buried, and now Kael's fate and the fate of Eldoria hangs in the balance. But the relic isn't just a tool, it's a parasite, its dark energy seeping into his veins, twisting his thoughts and forcing him to face the truth. He may have traded one life for another. This is the story of how one desperate act sets off a chain of events that will test Kael's courage, unravel the curse of Eldoria, and force him to confront the guilt he's carried for far too long. The air in Black Hollow hung heavy, thick with the scent of decay and despair. Kael's boots crunched against the brittle earth as he hurried through the village, his heart pounding in rhythm with the relic's faint, ominous hum. The once thriving settlement was now a skeleton of its former self-crumbling homes, shattered windows, and the faint, ghostly glow of lanterns that seemed to flicker with the last vestiges of hope. His sister, Lyra, lay in a small, dimly lit hut, her face pale and slick with sweat. Her breathing was shallow, each gasp a struggle that tore at Kael's resolve. He knelt beside her, clutching the relic tightly. Its surface was cold, unnaturally so, and the whispers it emitted had grown more insistent since he'd first taken it. He placed it near her, hoping against hope that its dark energy would somehow reverse the curse that had claimed her strength. But instead of healing, her fever spiked, her body trembling as if rejecting the relic's touch. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, echoing in his mind like a distant storm. "Take it to the heart," they hissed, "to the source. Only there can the curse be broken." Kael's hands trembled as he pulled the relic away, his mind a whirlwind of doubt and fear. He wanted to save Lyra, needed to, but the relic's power was unpredictable, its motives unclear. Before he could gather his thoughts, the sound of heavy footsteps outside broke the silence. Through the cracked door, he saw them, shadowy figures cloaked in darkness, their eyes glowing like embers. The Wraith Guard, they moved with purpose, their presence suffocating, and Kael knew they had come for the relic. Panic surged through him. He couldn't fight them, not here, not now. With a heavy heart, he turned to the village healer, an elderly woman with kind eyes and hands worn by years of tending to the sick. "Keep her safe," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. "I'll come back for her, I swear it." The healer nodded, her expression a mix of sorrow and understanding. As Kael slipped out the back door, the relic clutched tightly to his chest. The cursed wilderness stretched before him, a desolate expanse of twisted trees and jagged rocks. The relic's pull grew stronger with every step, guiding him toward the heart of the kingdom, where the source of the curse awaited. His mind raced with questions, doubts, and the haunting image of Lyra's weakened form, but there was no turning back now. The Wraith Guard were closing in, and the relic's whispers promised answers that might save Lyra or destroy them both. As he vanished into the shadows of the cursed forest, the relic's hum grew louder, a constant reminder of the path he had chosen. The journey ahead was fraught with danger, but Kael knew one thing for certain: whatever lay in the heart of the cursed kingdom would change everything, for better or for worse. The air in Mornwood was thick with an eerie stillness, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves that seemed to carry whispers that clung to the shadows. Kael pressed on, his boots sinking into the damp, moss-covered ground. The trees here were ancient, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching out to snatch him. Every step felt heavier, as if the forest itself resisted his presence. The whispers grew louder, fragments of a language he couldn't understand, yet their meaning seeped into his mind. They spoke of a curse, of a kingdom lost to time, and of a relic that carried the weight of destruction. It was then that he saw her, a figure cloaked in tattered gray robes, standing motionless beneath the canopy. Her pale eyes glimmered with an otherworldly light as she turned to face him. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice soft but firm, "and you shouldn't carry that." Her gaze fell to the relic at his side, and Kael instinctively reached for it, his fingers tightening around its cold, jagged surface. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. "Alara," she replied simply, "and I know what you seek, but what you carry is no mere trinket. It is a fragment of the Obsidian Crown, the very artifact that doomed Eldoria." Kael's jaw tightened. He had heard the stories, of course, the tales of a king's hubris, of a crown forged in darkness, and of a curse that swallowed an entire kingdom. But those were just stories, weren't they? "You expect me to believe that," he scoffed. "It's just a relic, a piece of the past." Alara stepped closer, her movements unnervingly silent. "The past has a way of clinging to the present," she said. "That relic will consume you, Kael. It will twist your thoughts, your memories, until you no longer recognize yourself. If you let me, I can guide you to the ruins of Eldoria. There, you might find the answers you seek, and perhaps a way to break the curse." Kael hesitated. He didn't trust her, couldn't trust her, but the weight of the relic at his side felt heavier with each passing moment. Reluctantly, he nodded, "Lead the way." As they ventured deeper into the forest, the light dimmed, and the whispers grew into a cacophony of voices. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches forming a tangled web overhead. Kael's breath quickened, his senses on edge. Then, without warning, the forest shifted. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to ripple like water. Visions flooded his mind, scenes of a kingdom in flames, of a king kneeling before a shadowy figure, of a crown shattering into pieces that scattered across the land. The images were vivid, overwhelming, and they carried with them a sense of despair, so profound it made his chest ache. He saw the moment the curse was born, a dark pact sealed in blood and betrayal. And then, as quickly as they came, the visions faded, leaving him trembling and disoriented. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Elara's expression was unreadable. "The forest remembers," she said, "and it wants you to remember too." Kael's grip on the relic tightened, but now it felt different, hot, almost alive. His thoughts churned with doubt. Could Alara be trusted, or was she leading him into a trap? And what if the visions were real? What if the curse was already taking hold of him? The forest around them seemed to close in, its darkness pressing against him like a living thing. Kael's heart pounded as he struggled to steady himself. He had come this far, but now, with every step, he felt as though he were walking into a nightmare, one he wasn't sure he could escape. As Kael and Alara stepped into the ruins of Eldoria's capital, the weight of centuries pressed down on them. The once great city now lay in ruins, its grandeur reduced to jagged spires that clawed at the sky like broken fingers. The streets, once bustling with life, were now fractured and overgrown, swallowed by time and shadow. The air hung heavy with the acrid stench of decay, a constant reminder of the kingdom's fall. Every step they took echoed unnaturally, as if the city itself whispered warnings to those who dared disturb its silence. Shadows seemed to writhe and shift at the edges of their vision, as though the darkness held a life of its own. It was here, among the desolation, that the Wraith Guard emerged. Cloaked in tattered black robes, their hollow eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their voices rasped like wind through dead branches. They demanded the relic, their words sharp and commanding, their presence suffocating. Kael's hand instinctively went to the amulet at his chest, its cold surface pulsing faintly, as if it sensed the danger. The attack came without warning. The Wraith Guard moved like shadows given form, their weapons slicing through the air with deadly precision. Kael fought back with everything he had, his blade flashing as he parried and struck. But the relic's power surged within him, a dark current he could no longer control. In a moment of desperation, he unleashed it, a burst of energy so violent it tore through the air like a storm. When the light faded, one of the Wraith Guard lay unmoving, their form dissolving into ash. Kael staggered back, his breath ragged, his hands trembling. He stared at the spot where the Wraith Guard had fallen, horrified by what he'd done. The relic's power had always been a double-edged sword, but now it felt like a curse. It wasn't just a tool, it was changing him, twisting something inside. Alara's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and urgent. "Kael, this thing, it's dangerous. You saw what it did. You have to destroy it before it consumes you." But Kael shook his head, his grip tightening on the amulet. "I can't, not yet. This is the only way to save Lyra. I can't give up now." The tension between them grew thicker than the air around them. Alara's eyes burned with frustration, her loyalty to Kael warring with her growing fear of the relic. She had always trusted him, but now she saw the cracks forming in his resolve. The amulet's dark energy seemed to whisper to him, pulling him deeper into its grasp. As they pressed on through the ruins, the partnership that had once been unshakable began to fray. Kael's obsession with the relic deepened, his focus narrowing to the point where even Alara's warnings seemed distant, like echoes in the wind. The path ahead was uncertain, and the cost of their journey was becoming clearer with every step. The relic's power was not just a weapon, it was a test, one that threatened to tear them apart. As Kael and Alara stepped into the shadowed heart of the ruins, The air grew heavy with the weight of centuries. Before them loomed an ancient temple, its blackened stones etched with symbols that seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. This was no ordinary place. It was a sanctuary dedicated to the Obsidian Crown, the very source of the kingdom's curse. The air crackled with an unnatural energy, and the ground beneath their feet felt unstable, as if the earth itself recoiled from the temple's presence. At the entrance, a monstrous creature emerged from the darkness, its form a grotesque fusion of bone and shadow. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and its roar echoed through the ruins like a death knell. This was no ordinary beast. It was a remnant of the curse, a guardian bound to protect the temple's secrets. Kael gripped the relic tightly, feeling its power surge through him, a strange warmth that both comforted and unnerved him. He knew this was the moment to act. With a shout, Kael channeled the relic's energy, unleashing a blinding burst of light that struck the creature with devastating force. The beast howled in agony, its form dissolving into ash and shadow. Victory, however, came at a price. As the relic's energy faded, Kael felt a coldness seep into his veins, a subtle but undeniable presence that whispered at the edges of his mind. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but soon it grew clearer. A voice deep and commanding, promising him power beyond measure. The voice belonged to the cursed king, trapped within the relic. It spoke of Lyra, of her fate, of the chance to save her if only Kael would bring the relic to the throne room. The king's words were honeyed, each syllable laced with temptation. For a moment, Kael wavered. The thought of saving his sister was all he had clung to, and now the voice offered him the means to do just that. But Alara's sharp voice cut through the temptation like a blade. "Don't listen to him," she warned, her eyes blazing with urgency. "The king's promises are lies. He only wants to use you to break free from the relic." Kael stood torn, the weight of his choice pressing down on him like a mountain. Trusting the voice could mean saving Lyra, but it could also unleash the king's curse anew. Destroying the relic might end the threat, but it could also mean losing any chance to save his sister. The relic pulsed in his hand, a reminder of the power within his grasp, and the danger it carried. Every breath felt heavier, every heartbeat louder, as Kael faced the impossible decision to risk everything for hope, or to sacrifice that hope to protect the kingdom. The silence that followed was deafening, his thoughts a storm of fear, doubt, and resolve. The air grew colder as Kael and Alara descended deeper into the temple, their footsteps echoing against the ancient stone walls. Torches flickered weakly, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe like living things. At last, they reached the throne room, a cavernous chamber where the air itself felt heavy with the weight of centuries. The throne, carved from black obsidian, loomed at the center, its surface shimmering with an unnatural light. And there, seated upon it, was the spirit of the cursed king, his form wispy and translucent, yet radiating an undeniable presence. Kael of the Broken Land, the king's voice echoed, deep and resonant. "You have come far, and your courage is worthy of reward. Take the Obsidian Crown, and its power shall be yours. With it, you can break the curse that plagues this kingdom, and heal the one you love." The king's words hung in the air, tempting and treacherous. Kael's heart raced as he thought of Lyra, her fragile body growing weaker with each passing day. The crown glimmered, its dark beauty almost hypnotic, promising salvation, but something felt wrong. The king's voice, though smooth and persuasive, carried a faint edge, like the hiss of a serpent. Kael hesitated, his instincts screaming that this was a trap. Before he could speak, Alara stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with urgency. Kael, don't listen to him. The crown isn't the answer. It's the source of the curse. She turned to the king, her gaze fierce. I am Alara, descendant of the last queen of this kingdom. I know the truth. The crown's power corrupted you, and it will corrupt anyone who wields it. The king's spirit flickered, his calm demeanor cracking for the first time. Silence, he roared, his voice shaking the very walls. You know nothing of sacrifice, of the burdens I bore for this kingdom. The throne room trembled, dust and debris raining from the ceiling as the king's anger grew. Kael looked between Alara and the crown, torn between his desperation to save Lyra and the dread of what the crown's power might unleash. The ground beneath them began to crack, the walls groaning as if the temple itself were alive and furious. Alara grabbed Kael's arm, her voice urgent. There's no time. You have to choose. The crown will destroy everything, or we can find another way to save Lyra. But you can't trust him. Kael's mind raced, the weight of the decision crushing him. He wanted to believe the king, to believe that this cursed relic could be the key to Lyra's survival. But deep down, he knew Alara was right. The crown was a weapon, not a cure. The king's spirit grew more volatile, his form pulsing with dark energy. Take the crown or lose everything. He bellowed, his voice filled with desperation. The throne room began to collapse around them, massive stones crashing to the ground as the ceiling gave way. Kael clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He had to act now, but what choice could he make that wouldn't doom them all? Kael's grip tightened around the relic, its pulsing energy growing weaker as the storm outside the throne room raged louder. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, but there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, he raised the relic high above his head and brought it crashing down against the ancient throne. The sound of shattering crystal echoed through the room, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then, a blinding light burst forth, and the king's spirit erupted in a howl of fury, his form dissolving into wisps of shadow as the relic's power was unleashed. The curse, bound to the relic for centuries, began to unravel. The throne room trembled violently, cracks spreading across the walls and ceiling. Kael grabbed Alara's hand as chunks of stone rained down around them. They sprinted for the exit, barely making it through the collapsing archway as the room behind them crumbled into dust. The ground shook beneath their feet as they raced through the palace, the air thick with debris and the fading echoes of the king's rage. Emerging into the open, they stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath. The sky, once choked with swirling black clouds, began to clear. Pale sunlight broke through, and the oppressive weight that had hung over Eldoria for generations lifted. Kael looked down at his hands, feeling the relic's dark influence fade from his veins. But as the curse lifted, so too did the hope that had fueled his journey. Lyra, his sister, his reason for everything, might not survive without the relic's power. The thought left him hollow, a deep ache settling in his chest. Alara placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice steady despite the chaos they just escaped. The curse is gone, Kael. Its hold on Eldoria is broken. That means its hold on Lyra might be broken too. There's still hope. Her words were a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge of despair. He nodded, though the weight of uncertainty still lingered. Together, they turned their gaze toward the horizon, where the distant hills of Black Hollow waited. The journey wasn't over yet. With the curse lifted, they could only hope that Lyra had been freed as well. As they set out, the first rays of sunlight warmed their faces, a quiet promise of renewal. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was a glimmer of hope. Kael and Alara stepped back into Black Hollow, the air heavy with the weight of all that had transpired. The village, once shrouded in despair, now seemed to breathe again, as if the curse's end had breathed life into its very stones. They found Lyra in the heart of the village, her once pale cheeks now flushed with color, her strength returning with every passing moment. When her eyes met Kael's, they filled with tears of relief and joy. She ran to him, wrapping her arms around him, as though he were a dream she feared might vanish. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, and Kael allowed himself to feel the warmth of her embrace, a rare comfort in the storm of his thoughts. But as the moment passed, the shadows crept back into his mind. The faces of those he had failed, the choices he had made, and the lives he had endangered haunted him like specters. He had brought the curse to an end, but at what cost? The question gnawed at him, a relentless reminder of his past. That night, beneath a sky streaked with stars, he confided in Alara, his voice heavy with guilt. She listened in silence, her gaze steady and unwavering. When he finished, she placed a hand on his shoulder and spoke words that carried the weight of certainty. Redemption isn't found in dwelling on the past, Kael. It's found in what you do now. Use your skills to help others, to rebuild what was broken. That's where you'll find your peace. Her words lingered in his mind long after she had spoken them. The next morning, Kael made his decision. He would stay in Black Hollow, not as a man running from his past, but as one determined to shape a better future. The village needed him, and he needed them. Together, they began the slow, arduous work of rebuilding, repairing homes, tending to the wounded, and fortifying the village against the lingering remnants of the curse. Though the scars of the past remained, there was a newfound hope, a sense of purpose that had been absent for far too long. Alara, ever the wanderer, prepared to leave. Her path was her own, and her journey was far from over. But as she stood at the edge of the village, she turned to Kael with a promise. This isn't goodbye. I'll return, and when I do, I expect to see this place thriving. Kael nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He knew her words were more than a promise. They were a reminder that he wasn't alone, even as he stayed behind. As the days turned into weeks, Kael found himself slowly shedding the weight of his guilt. Each stone he laid, each life he touched, brought him closer to the redemption Alara had spoken of. The village began to flourish under his care, its people finding strength in his leadership. And though the road ahead was long, Kael began to feel something he had thought lost peace. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without its challenges, but it was real. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to believe that, perhaps, he had found a way to atone for his mistakes. The seasons turned, and Black Hollow flourished like a garden after a long drought. Fields once barren now overflowed with golden wheat, and laughter echoed through streets that had long been silent. Kael, the blacksmith turned leader, stood at the heart of it all. The villagers praised him, their voices filled with gratitude, their eyes shining with hope. Yet, for all their admiration, Kael carried a quiet unease, a shadow that lingered in the corners of his mind. The weight of his past, the choices he'd made, and the blood he'd shed clung to him like a second skin. One restless night, as the moon hung low and the wind whispered through the trees, Kael found himself in a dream that felt too real to dismiss. The cursed king appeared before him, his form flickering like a dying flame. His voice, cold and distant, echoed a warning. The Obsidian Crown's power is not fully destroyed. Kael awoke with a start, his heart pounding, the words echoing in his mind. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was nothing more than a lingering fear, a remnant of the darkness he'd fought so hard to escape. But the village didn't feel the same after that. The air seemed heavier, the nights darker. Whispers of strange shadows began to spread, shadows that moved on their own, slinking through the forest like predators stalking prey. At first, Kael dismissed the rumors as the superstitious fears of a people still healing from their trauma. Yet, when he ventured into the woods himself, he saw them, dark, shapeless forms that vanished the moment he approached. The forest, once a place of refuge, now felt like a living, breathing threat. Kael knew he couldn't ignore it. The curse he thought he'd broken might still have its claws in the world, and if it did, Black Hollow was in danger once more. With resolve hardening in his chest, he prepared to investigate. He gathered his tools, his blade, and the remnants of the courage that had carried him this far. The villagers watched him go, their faces a mix of hope and fear. They had come to rely on him, to believe in him. Kael wouldn't let them down. Whatever lay in the forest, whatever darkness still lurked, he would face it. The curse would not return, not on his watch. The dense forest loomed around Kael like a living, breathing entity, its gnarled trees twisting skyward as if reaching for some unseen force. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and every step he took seemed to echo louder than it should. He moved cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, senses heightened. It wasn't long before he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. A hidden shrine, its stone walls slick with moss and etched with ancient runes that pulsed faintly with an eerie, dark light. At its center stood an altar, and atop it rested a fragment of the Obsidian Crown, radiating a malevolent energy that seemed to claw at his very soul. But Kael wasn't alone. Huddled around the shrine were figures cloaked in black, their faces obscured by hoods. They chanted in a guttural tongue, their voices rising and falling in unison, as though summoning something ancient and terrible. Kael pressed himself against a tree, his breath shallow, as he listened to their words. The cultists spoke of the crown's scattered fragments, hidden across Eldoria, and their plans to reunite them. Their goal was clear, to resurrect the cursed king, a tyrant whose reign had plunged the land into darkness centuries ago. The weight of their words settled heavily on Kael's shoulders. If they succeeded, Eldoria would be lost. He knew he couldn't face them alone. The cultists outnumbered him, and the dark power they wielded was beyond anything he had encountered. Retreating silently, Kael made his way back to Black Hollow, his mind racing. The village, once a place of refuge, now felt like the last bastion of hope in a world teetering on the edge of ruin. He gathered his allies, sharing what he had learned. The fight ahead would not be easy. The cultists were relentless, driven by a fanatical devotion to their cause. Kael realized that stopping them would require more than strength. It would demand cunning, strategy, and perhaps even sacrifices he wasn't sure he was ready to make. As he prepared for the coming confrontation, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the precipice of a battle far greater than he had ever imagined. The shrine in the forest was just the beginning. Somewhere out there, the remaining fragments of the Obsidian Crown waited, their dark power calling to those who sought to wield it. Kael's journey was far from over, and the fate of Eldoria hung in the balance. Every decision, every step, would shape the future of the kingdom, and as he sharpened his blade and gathered his courage, one truth became clear. The fight to protect Eldoria was not just his burden, it was his destiny. Kael stood at the center of the village square, his voice cutting through the cold night air as he addressed the gathered villagers. Fear was etched on their faces, but so was determination. They had seen what the cultists were capable of, and they knew standing idle was no longer an option. With steady hands and a calm demeanor, Kael began to teach them the basics of defense: how to hold a weapon, how to work together, and how to use the terrain to their advantage. He moved among them, offering encouragement and correcting their stances, knowing that every moment counted. As the villagers trained, Kael's thoughts turned to Alara. He sent a runner with a hastily scribbled message, hoping his words would reach her in time. "The village is in danger. We need you." The plea was simple, but he knew if anyone could turn the tide against the cultists, it was her. Yet, even as he sent the message, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away. The attack came without warning. Shadows moved at the edge of the forest, and the air grew heavy with the sound of chanting. The cultists descended upon the village like a storm, their dark robes swirling as they advanced. Kael shouted commands, rallying the villagers to form a defensive line. Swords clashed, arrows flew, and the night was filled with the cries of battle. Kael fought with a ferocity born of desperation, his years as a thief giving him an edge in the chaos. He slipped through the fray like a ghost, using his agility and cunning to outmaneuver his enemies, but the cultists were relentless. They seemed to anticipate every move, their strength growing with each passing moment. Kael realized too late that their true goal wasn't just to destroy the village, it was to claim the relic hidden within. In the heat of the battle, a small group of cultists broke through the defenses and made their way to the village's sacred shrine. Kael raced after them, but he was too late. They emerged clutching a fragment of the relic, its eerie glow casting long shadows across the ground. The cultists retreated, vanishing into the night as quickly as they had come. The village was battered but still standing, thanks to Kael's leadership and the bravery of its people. Yet the victory felt hollow. Kael stared at the empty shrine, his mind racing. The cultists had what they wanted, and with every piece of the relic they claimed, their power grew. He knew he couldn't fight them alone any longer. The time for waiting was over. He had to act swiftly and decisively. before the darkness they wielded consumed everything. Kael pressed onward, his boots crunching against the brittle earth of a desolate wasteland that seemed to stretch endlessly under a sky choked with ash. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the land itself mourned what it had become. He moved cautiously, his senses sharp, tracking the faint traces left by the cultists. A scrap of cloth, a footprint in the dust, the lingering stench of decay. Each step brought him closer to their lair, but also deeper into danger. The wasteland was no mere expanse of barren land. It was a trap, designed to lure and ensnare. It wasn't long before the ambush came. From the shadows, the Wraith Guard emerged silent, spectral figures clad in armor that seemed to drink in the light. Their movements were unnervingly precise, their hollow eyes gleaming with malice. Kael fought valiantly, his sword slicing through the air with practiced precision, but the Wraith Guard were relentless. They moved as one, an unstoppable force, and soon Kael found himself overwhelmed. His weapons were torn from his grasp, his body bound in chains that burned with an unnatural cold. The cultists had found their prize. Dragged through the wasteland, Kael was taken to a grim fortress that loomed like a jagged tooth against the horizon. Its walls were blackened stone, etched with runes that pulsed faintly with a sickly green light. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of blood and incense, the hallways echoing with the chants of the fanatical. He was brought before the cult's leader, a figure cloaked in shadow, their voice a low, grating rasp that seemed to slither into Kael's mind. The leader spoke of the cursed king, of a new era of power that would rise from the ashes of the old world. To them, Kael was nothing more than a pawn, a means to an end. What followed was a trial of endurance. Bound to a cold stone slab, Kael was subjected to torment meant to break his spirit. Every question was followed by pain, every refusal by more agony. The cultists demanded the location of the remaining relic fragments, but Kael clenched his teeth and held fast. Each moment felt like an eternity, his body battered and his mind fraying at the edges. Doubt crept in, whispering that he could not endure, that his mission was doomed. But then, in the darkest moment, he remembered Alara's voice, soft but unwavering. She had spoken of redemption, of the strength found in purpose, and her words became a lifeline. Though his body was broken, Kael's resolve hardened. He would not yield. He could not. Somewhere deep within him, a spark of defiance flared, and he clung to it with everything he had. The cultists could take his strength, his freedom, even his hope, but they would never take his will. And so, as the hours stretched on, Kael endured, his mind focused not on the pain, but on the flicker of light that still burned within him. The battle was far from over, and he would not let it end here. Kael's breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled through the darkened corridors of the stronghold, his body bruised and battered, but his spirit unbroken. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and the faint hum of dark magic, but he pressed on, driven by a singular purpose. Just as he reached the edge of the fortress, a figure stepped out of the shadows, a hooded cultist whose eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. "This way," the stranger whispered, gesturing toward a hidden passage. "I've seen enough of this madness. The leader has lost his way, and I won't be part of it any longer." With the cultist's guidance, Kael slipped through the labyrinth of tunnels, each step taking him farther from the nightmare he had endured. As they neared the exit, the cultist hesitated, then spoke again, his voice low and urgent. The remaining fragments, they are being gathered at the shrine in the forest. If they complete the ritual there, it's over. You must stop them before the cursed king rises. Kael nodded, his jaw tightening with resolve. He didn't have time to question the cultists' motives. The clock was ticking, and the stakes had never been higher. Emerging into the cold night air, Kael felt a surge of relief as the heavy walls of the stronghold faded behind him, but there was no time to rest. He pushed forward, his thoughts racing toward Black Hollow, the only place where he might find allies. When he finally reached the village, weary and bloodied, he was met by a familiar face. Alara stood at the edge of the forest, her expression a mix of worry and determination. "I knew you'd come back," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken fears. "But we're running out of time." Together, they retreated to the safety of a dimly lit cabin, where the faint glow of a lantern cast long shadows on the walls. Kael recounted his harrowing escape and the cultist's warning, while Alara shared what she had learned in his absence. The shrine in the forest was no ordinary place. It was a nexus of ancient power, a site where the veil between worlds was thin. If the cultists succeeded in gathering the fragments there, the cursed king's resurrection would be unstoppable. "This is it," Kael said, his voice steady despite the gravity of their task. "We have to strike now, before they're ready." Alara nodded, her eyes narrowing with focus. "We'll need a plan," she said, spreading a rough map across the table. "The shrine is heavily guarded, but if we move quickly and strike at their weakest point, we might have a chance." As they plotted their assault, the weight of their mission settled over them like a heavy cloak. They both knew the odds were against them, but they also knew there was no other choice. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about saving everything they held dear. The air in the cabin grew tense as they finalized their strategy, each detail a piece of a puzzle that could mean the difference between victory and ruin. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, as if the forest itself sensed the battle to come. Kael glanced at Alara, her face illuminated by the flickering lantern light, and felt a surge of determination. They had faced impossible odds before, and they would do it again. Together, they would march into the heart of the forest, toward the shrine where their fates, and perhaps the fate of the world, would be decided. The night was thick with tension as Kael and Alara moved silently through the forest, the faint glow of the shrine's torches flickering in the distance. Behind them, the villagers followed, their faces set with determination, their hands gripping makeshift weapons. This was no ordinary raid. It was a desperate gamble to end the cult's reign of terror before the relic's power could spread further. As they approached the shrine, the air grew heavy with an unnatural energy, a palpable dread that made every step feel like wading through quicksand. Kael signaled for the group to halt, his eyes scanning the perimeter. The shrine loomed ahead, its jagged spires clawing at the sky like the bones of some ancient beast. Inside, the cult leader awaited, his presence radiating a malevolent force that seemed to warp the very fabric of the night. Kael knew this would be their only chance. Failure wasn't an option. With a sharp nod, he and Alara led the charge, the villagers surging forward with a roar that shattered the eerie silence. Chaos erupted as the two forces clashed. The cultists fought with a frenzied ferocity, their eyes glowing with the relic's cursed light. Kael and Alara carved their way through the fray, their movements a blur of steel and determination. But the true threat awaited at the heart of the shrine. There, the cult leader stood, a fragment of the relic clutched in his hand, its power pulsing like a second heartbeat. The air around him crackled with energy, and his voice boomed like thunder as he taunted Kael, promising a fate worse than death. Kael charged, his sword flashing in the dim light. The leader's power was overwhelming, each strike sending shockwaves that threatened to shatter Kael's resolve. But Kael was quick, his agility and cunning his greatest weapons. He dodged and weaved, his movements calculated, his mind racing to find an opening. Yet even as he pressed the attack, the relic's power proved too much. A single blow sent Kael sprawling, his body battered and bleeding. Struggling to his feet, Kael's vision blurred, but his determination burned brighter than ever. With a final surge of strength, he lunged at the leader, not with his sword, but with his bare hands, grasping the fragment of the relic. The energy seared his skin, but he held on, pouring every ounce of his will into destroying it. The relic shattered with a deafening crack, its power dissipating in a blinding flash. The cult leader staggered, his strength faltering, his connection to the relic severed. It was then that Alara struck. Her blade pierced the leader's heart, her face a mask of grim resolve. The shrine began to collapse around them, its foundations crumbling as if the land itself rejected the evil that had festered within. Kael and Alara barely made it out, dragging the wounded villagers with them. As they emerged into the cool night air, the shrine collapsed in a cloud of dust and debris, its dark legacy buried beneath the rubble. The villagers erupted in cheers, their voices a chorus of relief and triumph. But Kael's thoughts were elsewhere. The battle had been won, but the cost was steep. His body ached, his wounds a reminder of the price they had paid. Yet, as he looked at Alara, her face illuminated by the rising moon, he felt a glimmer of hope. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, but the fight was far from over. The relic's fragments still lingered, and the shadows they cast were long and deep. Together, they would face whatever came next. Kael awoke to the dim, flickering light of a fire, the air thick with the scent of herbs and damp earth. His body felt heavy, every muscle aching as though it had been stretched too thin. He blinked slowly, his vision clearing to reveal the familiar, shadowy walls of Black Hollow. The wounds across his chest and arms were wrapped in clean bandages, the faintest traces of blood seeping through, healing, but not quickly. He shifted slightly, wincing at the sharp sting that followed, and turned his head to see Alara sitting nearby, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You're awake," she said softly, her voice carrying a mix of relief and exhaustion. Her eyes, usually so sharp and determined, now held a quiet sadness. "The curse, it's gone, Kael. The kingdom is safe." A wave of relief washed over him, but it was fleeting, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that seemed to settle into his very soul. He had carried the weight of this fight for so long, too long, and now that it was over, he felt hollow, as though the battle had taken more from him than just his strength. Kael took a slow, steadying breath, his gaze drifting to the fire. "The village, they'll need a leader," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it can't be me, not anymore." Alara's brow furrowed, and she leaned forward, her hands reaching out as if to stop him from saying more. "Kael, you've done so much. You've given everything. The people will understand if you need time to recover, but they need you. They trust you." He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "They deserve someone who can lead them with a whole heart, someone who isn't broken." His voice cracked on the last word, and he looked away, unable to meet her eyes. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Then Alara spoke again, her voice steady but gentle. "If that's what you need, then I'll support you. But you don't have to do this alone, Kael. Let me stay with you. Let me help you find your way back." He turned to her then, his expression softening. "You've already done so much, Elara, more than I could ever ask for. But this is something I need to do on my own. I need to find myself again, or maybe find who I'm meant to be now that the fight is over." Elara studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to memorize every detail. Finally, she nodded, though her lips pressed into a thin line. "I understand," she said quietly, "but promise me this. When you're ready, you'll let me know. I'll come back, I'll visit, whatever you need." Kael reached out, his hand brushing hers briefly. "I promise," he said, his voice steady now, though it carried the weight of unspoken gratitude. As Alara rose to leave, the firelight cast long shadows across the walls, and Kael felt a strange mix of loss and freedom. The curse was gone, the kingdom was safe, and yet, for the first time in years, he was truly alone. But it wasn't a loneliness that frightened him. It was quiet, almost peaceful, like the first breath of air after a long, suffocating storm. And as he closed his eyes, Kael allowed himself to believe that, perhaps, this was the beginning of something new. Kael wandered the land, his footsteps carving a path through forgotten villages and shadowed forests. The weight of his past still lingered, a quiet companion to his every thought, but he no longer let it define him. Instead, he turned his skills, once honed in the art of thievery, toward a new purpose. Wherever he went, he sought out those who had been wronged, those who had no one else to turn to. A stolen loaf of bread became a lifeline for a starving family, a smuggled weapon, a means for a village to defend itself against bandits. Kael became a shadow in the night, not for profit, but for justice. Yet even as he helped others, he couldn't escape the echoes of his own choices. The faces of those he'd failed haunted him, whispering reminders of what he'd lost. Still, there was a strange peace in knowing he was making amends, however small. Each act of kindness, each life he touched, felt like a step toward redemption. He didn't expect forgiveness, not from others, and certainly not from himself, but he found solace in the simple belief that he was doing something good. One crisp morning, as the sun spilled its golden light over a quiet meadow, a messenger approached him. The letter bore a familiar seal, one that stirred memories of a time when he had dared to hope for a different life. Inside, Alara's handwriting greeted him, her words steady and warm. She spoke of finding her own purpose, of a place where she was building something meaningful. And then the invitation, an offer to join her, to stand by her side once more. Kael stood still for a long time, the letter clutched in his hands. He thought of Alara, her strength, her kindness, the way she had always seen the best in him, even when he couldn't see it himself. The offer was tempting, a chance to leave the wandering life behind and find stability, perhaps even happiness. But his journey wasn't over. There were still shadows to chase, still people who needed his help. And so, he folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his pack. He would carry her words with him, a reminder of the possibilities that lay ahead. For now, though, his path was his own to walk. Kael's journey led him through dense forests and across mist-shrouded mountains, each step bringing him closer to the sanctuary Alara had built. Nestled in a hidden valley, the sanctuary was a beacon of hope for those scarred by the curse, a place where the weary could find shelter and the broken could begin to heal. As he approached, the sight of its towering spires and vibrant gardens struck him, a stark contrast to the desolation he had left behind. Alara greeted him at the gates, her presence as calming as the sanctuary itself. She had always been a force of compassion, and now her vision had grown into something extraordinary. "We've created a refuge," she explained, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "But it's not enough to heal wounds. We need to defend what we've built. There are those who see this place as a prize, a source of power to be taken." She paused, her eyes locking with his. "We need someone like you, Kael, someone who understands the cost of fighting for what matters." Her words resonated deep within him. For years, Kael had wandered, burdened by his past and the weight of his choices. But here, in this place of light amidst the darkness, he felt something shift. A flicker of purpose ignited within him, one that had long been buried beneath layers of guilt and regret. Without hesitation, he agreed to stay. In the weeks that followed, Kael found himself stepping into a role he hadn't anticipated, but one that fit him perfectly. He began training a new generation of protectors, young men and women, eager to learn but untested by the trials he had faced. He taught them not just the skills of combat, but the wisdom of restraint, the importance of knowing when to fight and when to seek another way. His lessons were steeped in the hard-earned truths of his own journey, lessons of loss, resilience, and the fragile balance between power and responsibility. As he worked, Kael noticed something unexpected, a sense of peace settling over him. It wasn't the absence of struggle, there were still challenges, still threats lurking at the edges of the sanctuary, but rather a quiet certainty that he was where he was meant to be. For the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter, not because it had disappeared, but because he was no longer carrying it alone. The sanctuary became more than a refuge for those it sheltered. It became a home for Kael as well. In helping others rebuild their lives, he found himself rebuilding his own. And as he looked out over the valley each evening, the setting sun casting golden light across the land, he realized that this sense of purpose, this connection to something greater, was what he had been searching for all along. The years had weathered Kael, carving lines of wisdom and experience into his face, but his eyes still sparkled with the fire of a man who had lived a life worth remembering. Now an old man, he sat by the hearth in the village square, surrounded by a circle of wide-eyed children who hung on his every word. The firelight danced across their faces, as Kael wove tales of his adventures of battles fought, of curses broken, and of a kingdom once shrouded in darkness that now thrived under the light of hope. His voice, though softened by age, carried the weight of someone who had seen the world change and had played his part in shaping it. As he spoke, Kael's mind drifted back to the choices he had made, the paths he had walked. He remembered the mistakes, the moments of doubt, the times he had faltered, but he also remembered the redemption, the friendships forged in the heat of battle, and the quiet acts of courage that had defined his journey. He had not been perfect, but he had tried, and in the end, that was what mattered. The children laughed at his jokes and gasped at the thrilling parts of his stories, but Kael's heart swelled with a deeper sense of peace. He had spent his life fighting for something greater than himself, and now, as he looked at these young faces, he knew it had all been worth it. The fire crackled softly, its warmth wrapping around him like an old friend. Kael leaned back, his hands resting on his knees, and closed his eyes. The weight of his years seemed to lift for a moment, replaced by a quiet contentment. He had done what he set out to do. The world was safer, kinder, and brighter because of the choices he had made. And as the night deepened, the stories faded into the gentle hum of the fire, leaving only the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. The children whispered among themselves, but Kael remained still, a small smile playing on his lips. His journey was complete, and he was at peace. As the years turned into decades and the decades into centuries, Kael's name grew into something far greater than just a memory. It became a legend. His story, whispered around campfires and etched into ancient scrolls, spread across the land like the first rays of dawn after a long, dark night. The cursed kingdom of Eldoria, once a place of despair and ruin, was no longer spoken of with fear alone. Instead, it became a tale of caution, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the cost of vengeance. But woven into that warning was a thread of hope, a testament to the power of redemption. The sanctuary Kael had built, nestled in the heart of the reclaimed wilderness, flourished under the careful guidance of those he had trained, his disciples, now wise and weathered by time. It became a beacon of light in a world still touched by shadows. The people who lived there carried forward his teachings, not just in rituals or words, but in their actions. They healed the wounded, sheltered the lost, and stood as guardians against the darkness that still lingered at the edges of the world. Kael's legacy was not just in the walls of the sanctuary, but in the hearts of those who called it home. Yet, even as the world found peace, the shadows of the past were never far away. They lingered in quiet corners, in forgotten ruins, and in the hearts of those who still bore scars from the old wars. The fight for justice, for redemption, was not a battle that could be won once and for all. It was a flame that had to be tended, a responsibility that passed from one generation to the next. Kael's journey had ended, but his story was far from over. It lived on in the choices of those who came after him, in the courage of those who dared to stand against the darkness, and in the belief that even the smallest light could pierce the deepest night. And so, Kael's tale became more than just a legend. It became a call to action. It reminded the world that redemption was possible, even for those who had fallen the farthest. It showed that hope could rise from the ashes of despair, and that one person's courage could light the way for countless others. Though the shadows of the past would always remain, They served not as a source of fear, but as a reminder of what had been overcome and what could still be achieved. Kael's story was no longer just his own. It belonged to everyone who carried the torch forward, who dared to believe in a brighter tomorrow, and in that, his legacy would never truly end.